Hello friends, welcome to Apply IT. In this video, I am going to demonstrate behavior of all-settled method of Promise class in JavaScript. There are many static methods available in Promise class, and Promise.all.settled is one of the methods related to concurrency. So in this video, we'll understand behavior of Promise.all.settled method practically. If you are new and not aware, this is the 10th video in the series on JavaScript promises, where we try to understand advanced JavaScript concepts practically. If you haven't watched our previous videos, do watch them and then come back to this video for better understanding. You can find links for those videos in the video description. So let's jump into today's topic, understanding behavior of Promise.all.settled method practically. So first let's understand the problem that we are going to solve. So consider we have three different APIs available. Weather, that provides weather information through getWeather function. We have stocks API, which provides stock information through getStocks function. And we have news API, which provides news information using getNews function. We want to display information that is written by these three different APIs on a dashboard or say in console log. We are going to simulate these three APIs using different timing behavior. And we'll understand that if we use Promise.all.settle method, what behavior we get. And before that, we'll understand what behavior we achieve if we use Promise.all method instead of Promise.all.settle method. So we'll get practical understanding that in this situation, Promise.all.settle method will be useful instead of Promise.all method. So first we simulate getWeather API. So this function get whether it returns a fulfilled or resolved promise after 3 seconds. This function will return data as weather is windy today. So this is simulating successful API. In the same way we simulate get stocks API. This is also returning a fulfilled or resolved promise after 4 seconds. And we have get news API that is also returning fulfilled or resolved promise after 5 seconds. So here we are taking different timing behaviors using this set timeout function. So the first API is taking 3 seconds. The second API, that is get stocks API, it is taking 4 seconds, and get news API, that is taking 5 seconds. We have taken different timings of this each API so that we can observe that how it is going to impact to the final response that will be written by Promise.all or Promise.all.settled. So now we use all these three API functions in Promise.all. So using Promise.all, we can make call to all these APIs concurrently. So we are passing these three API functions to this Promise.all, and each API function is returning a promise that we provide as an input to all function. We have understood how this Promise.all function behaves in our previous video. So you can watch that video if you wish. So let's understand this situation practically. So let's go to Google Chrome and try to understand it. So we go to Google Chrome and we open Developers tool and we go to console. So here we are going to write our code. So first we write our getWeather function. Then we write our getStocks API function. Then we write getNews API function. So in the first situation, we have considered all promises are successful, or each API function is returning a resolved or fulfilled promise. Now we use Promise.all method to call all these API functions concurrently. So now let's call that wrapper function, which is going to use Promise.all method. Observe the behavior that we'll get by calling this getAll dashboard data function. So I'm hitting the enter key. So initially promise is pending, and after some time it gets settled, and after some time we get response. So we can observe that we are getting a response after 5 seconds. The reason is first API is taking 3 seconds, second API is taking 4 seconds, and the third API is taking 5 seconds. So once all APIs are successful, we are able to get a response after 5 seconds. So in the first situation, all APIs are successful. Now we consider another situation where one of the APIs is failing. We simulate that our stocks API is failing. So we'll modify our getStocks functions so that it is going to return a rejected promise. And first we will understand what will be the behavior of calling these three APIs concurrently using Promise.all. we'll observe that even if one API is failing, the final result will be failure. We simulate getStocks API is failing by returning a rejected promise from this getStocks function. So this is taking 4 seconds. So after 4 seconds, this API function will return a rejected promise. And we use same Promise.all function. This is our wrapper function which calls Promise.all, which takes an iterable of promises as input. So in this situation, the get weather is successful, get stocks is failing, and get news is also successful. Get weather is taking 3 seconds, get stocks is taking 4 seconds, and get news is taking 5 seconds. So we'll observe in the final output how much time it is taking. And the timing behavior we are observing using this console.time and console.timeEnd function. So how to use this console.time and console.timeEnd, we learned this in our previous video. So let's understand this practically. So now we are writing getStocks function again, but now it is returning a rejected promise. We have already defined this getAllDashboardData function, so we are just now calling because we haven't done any change in that function. So we are calling that function directly, and I'm going to hit enter key. So observe that the timing behavior, after how much time we get our response, final response, and also observe that what response we are getting, whether successful or it is failure. So we find that initially promise is pending. We can observe that after approximately 4 seconds, we get response. But here we find response as stock market is closed today. We are not able to get response of other two working API functions. So that error response we are getting from this console.log that we have put in the catch block. This part is not getting executed because Promise.all method is returning a rejected promise. So that throws an error condition and that gets caught in this particular part. We are getting this response from this catch part. Now we consider same situation where stocks API is failing. So here we are simulating if any one API is failing and still we want to get information and we want to display them on console, then how we can do it. So in this situation, we want to display data of all other working APIs. So instead of Promise.all method, now we use Promise.allSettled method. So we are just replacing that part here. Instead of all, we have written all settled, and rest of the code is same to our previous wrapper function. So now name of the wrapper function is get dashboard data. So let's understand this Promise.allSettled method. So Promise.allSettled method is a static method. It takes an iterable, for example, an array of promises as input, and this method also returns a single promise, but it differs in terms of return value. The return promise gets fulfilled when all input promises settle. So here the focus is on settle. It is not on fulfilled or rejected. So meaning of settle is promise is either fulfilled or rejected, but it's not pending. So let's understand this practically. So we define this get dashboard data wrapper function, which is taking Promise.allSettled for executing these three API functions concurrently. Now we are going to call that wrapper function and we'll observe the timing behavior and the response of this get dashboard data function. So initially promise is pending, and approximately after 5 seconds, we are getting a response from this wrapper function. So as a response, we find an array of objects where each object contains either status and value as property or status and reason as property. So this is the response that we are getting. The first one is corresponding to the weather API. The second one is corresponding to stock API, which we simulated that it is failing. So here we get status as rejected, and for the first API we get status as fulfilled, and the data that is held by that particular promise we get it through this value property. And the third one is related to news. News API is also successful, so we get status as fulfilled, and the data that is written by that API function we get through value property. Let's understand states of promises, that is pending versus settled. So we understand what is the meaning of this settled. So earlier we have learned the states of promises in our earlier video. I'm briefly discussing the important thing in this. So initially promise will be pending, and if API function is successful, the promise will be fulfilled, and if API function fails, the promise will be rejected. So whether promise is fulfilled or rejected, this both the state, they represent settled state. So Promise.all settled function is focusing on the settled state, which is a kind of virtual state. It's not a physical state that is existing, but if promise is fulfilled or rejected, it is considered as a settled state. So that is what is used by this Promise.all settled method. So Promise.all settled method will return a single promise which will contain data as an array of objects, where each object in array represent outcome of each promise. So this object contains status, which will be either fulfilled or rejected, and it will contain value or reason as another property, where value will contain data that is returned by the API function or is held by the promise object, and reason will contain the error information that is written by API function. It will contain the error information that is passed to the reject function. Now we display data or error. Once we get object like this, we can easily distinguish that which API is failing and which API is successful based on this status information or based on this status property. So let's modify this function. So here in the iteration, we check that if status is fulfilled, we display as API data is equal to API data.value, where this API data.value that represent this information or this information. We check status of the return object. If status is rejected, then we display it as API error is equal to API data.reason. So this reason we are getting from this particular property. So let's understand this practically. Now we have modified this get dashboard data function, which is checking the status, and based on that it is displaying information. It is displaying whether it has received data or it has received error. So now I'm going to call that wrapper function. So and observe timing behavior of this function and also observe the response we are getting. So initially promise is pending, and after approximately 5 seconds we are getting response. So here we can observe that the first API is successful, so we get API data. The second API is failing. We have simulated that our stock API fails, so we get API error is equal to stock market is closed today. And our third API, which is a news API, that is successful, so we get API data. And we observe that it is taking approximately 5 seconds to complete it. So here Promise.all settled method differs. In case of Promise.all method, if any one API is failing, then the final result will be failure. And Promise.all is not going to wait for other API functions. It is going to return rejected promise immediately. While in case of Promise.all settled method, this Promise.all settled method is going to wait till all the input promises get settled. So that's why it is waiting for completion of all API functions. Whether any API function is successful or it is failure, irrespective of that, it will wait for all API functions. So if you compare behavior of Promise.all versus Promise.all settled, so this is the behavior of Promise.all. If each API function is successful, final response will be successful, and if any one API is failing, in our case stock API is failing, the final return promise will be failure. The behavior of Promise.all settled method is like this. If all API functions are successful, or say all input promises are successful, the final response will be successful. Even if any one API is failing, the final response will be successful promise, or we say that it is a fulfilled promise, will not get rejected promise. And whichever API functions are successful, from that we'll be able to extract the information using value property, and whichever API is failing, for that API will be able to extract the reason of the failure using reason property from the object that it is returning. If you put them side by side, it is like this. So in the failure case, Promise.all and Promise.all settled method differ. In the case where all APIs are successful, the behavior of Promise.all and Promise.all settled method is same. But in case of failure, they differ. So to summarize, with Promise.all, if any one API fails, that is an input promise get rejected, then all other API calls or input promises will be discarded and the final result will be the first rejected promise. However, with Promise.all settled method, we can get data of successful APIs and reasons for failed APIs. So in case of Promise.all settled, even if all APIs fail, the final resultant promise written by this Promise.all settled will be fulfilled, so that we can know which individual APIs were successful and which are not successful. If you like this video, then give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comment section how this video was useful to you. If you have not subscribed this channel, then do subscribe it and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching and happy learning. We'll see you in the next video.